company is this Kayak One company, over. For an emergency situation, a kayak drive 30 kilometers from this town. I'm in rescue.
Kayak One.
They're set off on a city and
These fragmented words crackled over a maritime radio on the night of February 9th, 2007. After 29 days alone in the open ocean, Australian adventurer Andrew McAuley issued this chilling distress call, a final plea for help. The Tasman Sea around him was dark and unforgiving. Just beyond the black horizon lay the mountains of New Zealand's South Island, tantalizingly close. Who was going to save Andrew? Was he really going to make it to the finish line? You'll find out soon. Andrew McAuley's story as an adventurer began on cliff faces and alpine slopes. In the 1990s, he earned a reputation in the climbing world, not by scaling Everest or other famous peaks, but by seeking out new routes on obscure, formidable mountains. He had little interest in marquee peaks, instead testing himself on lesser-known challenges. McAuley pioneered big wall climbs in Australia and achieved first ascents in places like New Zealand's Southern Alps, Patagonia, and even the Himalayas. One notable example was an attempt on the south ridge of Nepal's Amadablam and the first ascent of a 5,400-meter spire called Mount Jo in Pakistan's Nangma Valley, all of which were routes far off the beaten path. His climbing prowess came with boldness and creativity, but also risk. In 1998, on a favorite climb in Australia's Bungonia Gorge, McAuley's life took a dramatic turn. While leading a route he called Evolution, a handhold suddenly broke away. McAuley plunged 30 meters down the rock face. Protection anchors ripped out as he fell, and he slammed knee first into the cliff. The impact shattered his patella, a devastating injury from which he never fully recovered. This climbing accident effectively ended his high-level mountaineering pursuits. The mountains had exacted a steep price, and doctors warned that his knee would remain a limiting factor. Yet McAuley's hunger for adventure did not vanish with that fall. It merely sought a new outlet. Coincidentally, earlier in 1998, Andrew and his wife Vicky had traveled to Patagonia, Chile, bringing along sea kayaks to approach remote granite spires called Dedos del Diablo for climbing. That trip planted a seed. After his accident, as McAuley slowly healed, he found himself drawn more and more to sea kayaking. Paddling offered the freedom of exploration without the stress on his injured knee. The knee injury meant that in the mountains, McAuley would reach his physical limit well before his mental one. In the kayak, there was no such limitation, one account noted. In the late 1990s, Andrew McAuley reinvented himself from a climber to a sea kayaker, carrying over that same fearless spirit that drove him up unclimbed peaks. By the early 2000s, Andrew McAuley had fully embraced ocean adventure. He applied the drive and tenacity of a mountaineer to pushing the boundaries of expedition kayaking. Over the next several years, McAuley methodically notched increasingly ambitious voyages, treating each as a preparation for something greater. He paddled across the Bass Strait, the treacherous 240-kilometer stretch between mainland Australia and Tasmania. Not once, but 3 times. Each crossing tested different routes and techniques. In one instance, he island hopped along the strait's eastern edge. In another, He took a western route with only a single stop. And finally, in 2003, he achieved the first non-stop kayak crossing of Bass Strait, spending 35 continuous hours at sea. In that super direct Bass Strait attempt, McAuley even nodded off from exhaustion, capsized, and managed to roll back up without missing a paddle stroke. A near disaster he shrugged off as just part of the challenge. Not stopping there, McAuley eyed bigger waters. In 2004, he completed a solo 530-kilometer traverse of the Gulf of Carpentaria in northern Australia. For nearly a week, he paddled through that remote gulf, even sleeping in his kayak at sea during the nights. Each expedition grew his skill and confidence. In 2006, he ventured with a team to the sub-Antarctic, kayaking over 800 kilometers along the forbidding coast of the Australian Antarctic Territory, even paddling inside the Antarctic Circle. By accumulating these feats, McAuley demonstrated an extraordinary tolerance for hardship and a methodical approach to adventure. Australian Geographic magazine named him Adventurer of the Year in 2005 for his string of kayaking exploits. Despite his ordinary day job as a 39-year-old IT consultant in suburban Sydney, McAuley's resume was anything but ordinary. Beneath the normal workday routine was a single-minded explorer, training for the ultimate test. After conquering Bass Strait, the Gulf of Carpentaria, and even Antarctic waters, McAuley turned his gaze to one of the most daunting ocean crossings imaginable: the Tasman Sea, the rough 1,600-kilometer expanse separating Australia and New Zealand. As his wife Vicky later recounted, once Andrew had crossed the Gulf, the Tasman Sea was all that was left in his mind. This would be his Everest, not a mountain of rock and ice, but a month-long voyage over some of the most tempestuous seas on the planet. The idea of kayaking solo from Australia to New Zealand had taken hold of McAuley for nearly a decade. He understood the magnitude of what he was planning: roughly 1,000 miles of open ocean, notorious for ferocious storms and 10-meter waves. A route many thought impossible for a lone paddler. Only a few had ever even tried. In fact, the legendary New Zealand paddler Paul Caffryn had made 2 attempts in the 1980s, both ending in failure and rescue, and authorities had forbidden Caffryn's later efforts as too dangerous. No one had yet successfully completed a solo kayak crossing of the Ditch, as the Tasman Sea is nicknamed. For Andrew McAuley, that was precisely the allure. "I guess I'm really drawn to a challenge like this. It's a real personal challenge. There's a great deal of satisfaction in coming up with an adventure that's unlikely and improbable," he told an interviewer from ABC Radio before the trip. McAuley framed the Tasman expedition as adventure for adventure's sake, not for fame or reward, but to answer an inner call. He had proven himself in shorter expeditions. Now he hungered to push into the unknown, to attempt what experienced seafarers deemed nearly suicidal. In writings later published by his wife, he reflected, "I've always been drawn to challenges at the sharp end of what is possible, initially with climbing and mountaineering, and more recently with sea kayaking. The Tasman Sea, with its howling winds and massive swells, was exactly the sharp end of possibility he felt compelled to face." Critics abounded. Seasoned sailors and rescue authorities publicly urged him not to go. Australia's Search and Rescue Service bluntly called the plan inherently dangerous. Even friends wondered if this was a step too far. But McAuley was methodical and unflinching. He spent years studying weather patterns and currents, training his body and mind, and fine-tuning his gear. Meticulous planning was one of his trademarks, the same trait that had kept him alive on remote mountains and in long kayak crossings. If he was going to dare the Tasman, he would leave as little to chance as possible. As he often insisted, he took risks, but they are calculated risks. In fact, the fact that the authorities eventually permitted his attempt at all speaks to his preparation. Paul Caffin's kayak had been impounded by officials before he could even launch in the 80s, whereas McAuley passed equipment tests that convinced skeptics his vessel could survive the seas. By December 2006, Andrew McAuley was ready to attempt his dream. He had meticulously charted a route from Fortescue Bay, Tasmania, on Australia's Southern Isle, heading northeast across the Tasman Sea to landfall at Milford Sound on New Zealand's South Island. The journey of roughly 1,600 kilometers was expected to take about 30 days, depending on weather. Summer in the Southern Hemisphere was the chosen window, but even summer storms on the Tasman can be ferocious. Undeterred, McAuley launched on his first attempt in mid-December 2006. It was meant to be a quiet start, but the Tasman Sea gave him an early warning. Within 48 hours, he experienced unexpected difficulties, not with waves or wind, but with cold. The makeshift sleeping setup inside the kayak was not retaining enough warmth, and McAuley found himself shivering uncontrollably during the first night at sea. Despite years of planning, this was a scenario he hadn't fully anticipated. The Tasman's chill penetrating his cramped cockpit and sapping his energy. With characteristic level-headedness, McAuley made the tough call to abort that attempt and turn back to Tasmania after just 1 or 2 nights out. On his expedition blog, he wrote about the decision, explaining that responsible adventure is character building and good for people. But he felt that to continue on this occasion was not on. He stated that making the right decisions in situations like this can save your life. It was a poignant reminder that even the bravest adventurers must recognize their limits. McAuley refused to force an ill-fated push. Instead, he returned to shore, regrouped, and addressed the problems. Over the next few weeks, he modified the canopy and his gear to improve insulation and comfort for sleeping. He added more thermal protection inside the cockpit and adjusted his clothing system for overnight stays. By early January, he was confident the issues were resolved. On January 11, 2007, in the gray light of dawn, Andrew McAuley set off once again from Tasmania's coast, paddling resolutely eastward into the Tasman Sea. This time, there was no fanfare, just the slap of waves on his hull and the call of seabirds overhead as he departed civilization. He carried 40 days of food and water and the weight of years of expectations. The early days of the voyage went smoothly. McAuley maintained a steady pace, paddling around 30 to 50 nautical miles per day when conditions allowed. He diligently checked in via satellite phone each evening, sending position updates that showed a tiny dot inching across a vast ocean on the tracking maps. The Tasman Sea greeted him with mixed moods, some days of calm, azure waters, other days where relentless chop and contrary winds made progress grueling. McAuley settled into a routine. Paddle for hours on end, navigating by GPS and sun, then, as night fell, deploy a sea anchor to stabilize the kayak, and crawl under the Casper canopy to rest. 2 weeks in, McAuley had paddled well over 1,000 kilometers, moving ever deeper into the roaring 40s latitude, infamous among mariners for unimpeded winds and sudden gales. He was completely alone, hundreds of miles from the nearest human being, with only albatrosses and the occasional curious dolphin for company. Yet, through fatigue and isolation, McAuley kept his spirits up by sticking to his plan. In recorded video diary snippets, he appeared upbeat, even contemplative about the beauty and simplicity of life at sea. However, he knew the hardest part was likely still ahead. As January neared its end, the Tasman Sea began to bare its teeth. In the final days of January 2007, the weather forecasts grew ominous. A deep low-pressure system was moving through the Tasman, and McAuley braced himself for a severe storm. He had little choice, as in the middle of the ocean there was nowhere to run, no shelter to seek. The only option was to face it. So he prepared, securing loose gear, double-checking Casper's clamps, donning his wetsuit and dry top, and mentally steeling himself for what was coming. When the storm hit, it was like a freight train in the dark. Winds surged up to 40 knots, waves built into 9-meter walls, and the kayak was tossed like a cork in a washing machine. McAuley deployed a sea anchor to keep the kayak pointed into the oncoming swell, then locked himself inside the Casper canopy to ride it out. For 28 hours straight, the storm pummeled him. The kayak crested massive swells, then plunged into troughs, each drop more violent than the last. He was capsized 3 times. The first 2 rolls were brief and self-corrected, but the third one was rough. A powerful wave caught the kayak at an angle, lifted it, and then flipped it over completely. The canopy helped the kayak roll back upright, but it was a brutal wake-up call. Inside, McAuley discovered water had penetrated the kayak and destroyed some of his key electronics. His backup satellite phone and GPS tracking unit had shorted out. The canopy had taken damage too, as one of the locking arms had cracked under pressure. Still, McAuley survived. When the sea calmed, he recorded a video diary entry, his face sunburnt, his voice tired but composed. He described the storm and what it did to him and his gear. He had made it through the worst weather he had encountered, likely the fiercest conditions seen in that region since the devastating 1998 yacht race storm. His main satellite phone was still working, and he pressed on. But now, his tools for safety were reduced. He had 1 sat phone, 1 radio, and a damaged canopy. He knew the journey was nearing its end, but the line between survival and failure was becoming increasingly thin. By early February 2007, Andrew McAuley was paddling through calmer waters and could finally see the peaks of New Zealand's South Island in the distance. It was a tremendous psychological boost. The worst was seemingly behind him. With over 1,500 kilometers already paddled, he now had less than 120 kilometers to go. On February 8th, McAuley managed to send what would be his final satellite message to Vicky. It was short, full of relief and confidence. See you 9 a.m. Sunday. That Sunday would be February 11th. He was planning to make landfall at Milford Sound. His GPS coordinates confirmed that he was within striking distance. The weather looked good. His pace was steady. His family, including Vicky and their young son Finley, flew to New Zealand to meet him. Fellow kayaker Paul Caffrin, whose failed attempts had inspired McAuley, also awaited him. They planned to paddle out and greet him in the water with ginger beer and whiskey in hand. Everyone was ready for a celebration. But the Tasman Sea still had one final surprise. On February 9th, the sun set over the Tasman Sea, and Andrew McAuley, now just 50 or 60 nautical miles from Milford Sound, prepared for what should have been his last night on the water. He likely planned to paddle through the next day and land triumphantly the following morning. Sometime that evening, around 7 o'clock p.m. New Zealand time, a radio signal crackled over the maritime frequency, monitored by the Coast Guard. This is Kayak One. Emergency. I'm about 30 kilometers from Milford Sound. Kayak is sinking. The message was barely audible. Static distorted parts of it. The operator on duty wasn't even sure who it was. The call was so vague that, for hours, they weren't sure it had come from Andrew at all. His EPIRB hadn't been activated, no distress beacon had gone off. But then came silence. The next morning, the recording was enhanced, the voice analyzed, and it was confirmed that it had been Andrew. He had radioed for help and then vanished. On February 10th, a full-scale search and rescue mission was launched. Aerial units swept the sea near his last known position. That evening, a search plane spotted something floating in the ocean. A yellow kayak, upside down, drifting about 34 miles off New Zealand's coast. When a boat reached it and pulled it aboard, they confirmed that it was McAuley's. The kayak was intact. The paddle, satellite phone, camera, GPS, all were still inside. The EPIRB had not been touched. His dry bags were still sealed, but the Casper canopy, the bright yellow dome that gave him shelter at night, was gone. The support arms that held it in place were broken, and Andrew himself was missing. There were no signs of violence, no shark attack, and no catastrophic boat damage. Just an empty kayak, eerily preserved, floating alone. Experts and fellow adventurers quickly pieced together what they believed happened. McAuley may have removed the canopy to prepare for sleeping or to get fresh air. Perhaps he was paddling without it since the weather was calm and the canopy had been damaged during the previous storm. If a wave struck when the canopy was stowed or partially unsecured, the kayak may have flipped violently. Without the canopy, the kayak would have lost its self-righting advantage. If McAuley wasn't wearing his dry suit, something he may have taken off in calm waters, he would have been instantly exposed to the cold Tasman Sea. Critically, he was not tethered to the kayak. In the event of capsize, this meant that one rogue wave could have easily separated him from the kayak entirely. If he tried to grab the VHF radio, make a call and hold on, but lost his grip on the boat, he would have no way to catch it again. It drifted, but he didn't. The EPIRB stowed inside became useless. There was no way to call for help again. He was likely left floating in the dark, exhausted, and slowly succumbed to the cold. By morning, he was gone. The search for Andrew McAuley was called off on February 12th. His body was never found. All that returned was his kayak and the voice recording of his final distress call. Andrew McAuley came within hours of finishing one of the greatest solo kayak journeys in human history. But unfortunately, he never reached land. So stories like this make me think about the difference between bravery and stupidity, and how fine that line can be. Making the conscious choice to put yourself in danger is something that people do all the time, for a thrill, for a rush, to feel more alive. But is it always worth it? Sometimes it is, but sometimes people take risks that are too big and shouldn't be taken. Thanks for joining me on another Friday. If you liked this video, please hit the like button and subscribe so that you don't miss another episode. I hope to see you again for more stories that are unusual, unsettling, and like the location of Andrew McAuley's final resting place, unsolved. This is Tony. I'll see you next time.